A glance through the rainy window. It was a cold Wednesday morning in downtown Los Angeles. The sky was cloaked in a blanket of gray clouds, and the streets were wet with fresh rain. Commuters rushed by, umbrellas bobbing in the sea of people, each wrapped in their own world of worries and routines. No one noticed the small, battered blue sedan parked near the edge of a quiet parking lot. But someone did. Someone always does when it matters. Keanu Reeves had just wrapped filming for an indie project the night before. Tired but satisfied, he decided to take a quiet morning drive, sipping coffee from a local corner shop he loved, one where the barista always wrote "Good Human" on his cup instead of his name. Keanu never cared for being recognized. He preferred moments where he could just be. This morning, something felt different. As he drove slowly past the lot, his gaze drifted through the light mist on his windshield and locked onto someone. A woman, likely in her mid-20s, was sitting in the driver's seat of that old sedan. Her hair was unbrushed, tied into a loose bun. She looked tired, worn beyond her years. In her arms, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, was a baby, no more than a few months old. The woman gently rocked the child, pressing her lips to the baby's forehead with the tenderness only a mother could carry, even in the face of despair. Keanu slowed his car, pulled over nearby, and sat in silence. He watched as the woman reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a crumpled bag of Cheerios, shaking a few into her palm before offering them to her baby like they were gold. She then glanced around nervously, perhaps afraid someone might tell her to move or call the police. But mostly, she looked defeated, not broken, but holding on by a thread. And that's when something stirred in Keanu, a feeling he couldn't ignore. Not pity, but a strong, aching sense of humanity. He saw someone who reminded him of his past, a time when he too had known loss, when he had felt the crushing weight of life pressing down. But he had people who had lifted him, reminded him of hope. What if he could be that for someone else now? Without hesitation, Keanu parked, took off his baseball cap, and walked slowly toward the car. He made sure to approach gently, not to scare her. As he got closer, the woman saw him and immediately looked alarmed. She quickly rolled the window up halfway and shielded the baby with her arm. Keanu raised his hand in a peaceful gesture. "Hi," he said softly, crouching a little so his eyes met hers. "I don't want anything. I just saw you here. I wanted to ask, are you okay?" She hesitated, then spoke. "We're fine. Just resting." Keanu noticed the dark circles under her eyes. Her voice trembled, not from cold, but from fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of rejection. Fear of someone calling the authorities. Maybe all of it. "My name's Keanu," he said kindly. "I'm not here to judge you. I care, that's all. Is there anything you need?" The woman stared at him. She seemed unsure if he was real or just another person pretending to care. She nodded slowly. "We're okay. Just passing through." Keanu smiled gently, then said, "Look, I don't want to intrude, but if you're okay with it, maybe I could bring you something to eat. Some warm food." She didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened a little. "For my baby?" she asked. "Of course," Keanu nodded. "For both of you." She hesitated again, then finally whispered, "Okay." Keanu gave her a thumbs up and headed straight to the nearby store. He didn't just grab food. He got a warm baby formula, some diapers, a soft blanket, a first aid kit, and 2 hot sandwiches. Then he ran back with a bag full of supplies. She accepted the items slowly, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you," she whispered, clutching the baby clothes. "I didn't catch your name," Keanu asked. "Alyssa," she said. "And this is Noah." Keanu smiled. Alyssa and Noah. Beautiful names. She looked at him, curious. "Are you that actor?" He chuckled lightly. "Sometimes. But today, I'm just someone who wanted to help." And that's how it started. A simple act of kindness. A chance encounter. But neither of them could imagine how their paths would change, how this moment in a rainy parking lot would start something so much bigger. Because what Keanu would do next would shake the world, not with fame, not with money, but with the raw, powerful reminder of what it means to be human. The warmth of a stranger's light. The cold still lingered in the air long after the rain had stopped. The pavement was damp and the sky a dull canvas of gray, but inside Alyssa's car, something had shifted. There was a warmth that hadn't been there before, not from the blanket or the food, though those brought comfort, but from the human connection. From a stranger who hadn't just looked her way, but truly seen her. Alyssa sat there for a long time after Keanu left, holding little Noah close to her chest, her fingers trembling as they brushed over his soft baby hair. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt visible again. Not as a problem, not as a burden, but as a mother doing her best in a world that often turned its back on the struggling. That night, Keanu couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his home, staring at the ceiling in silence. His mind kept returning to Alyssa's face, the lines of worry etched into her young features, the way her eyes scanned him with both hope and hesitation. He thought about Noah, his tiny hands peeking out from a blanket that was clearly too thin for the chill in the air. Keanu had seen pain before. He had lived through deep loss and grief, but something about this encounter reached into a different part of him, one that couldn't just walk away and move on. So, the next morning, before the city had even stirred awake, Keanu packed a small duffel bag. Inside it, he placed essentials, hygiene items, extra clothes, a power bank, and a handwritten note. Then he picked up a thermos of coffee and a few breakfast wraps from a quiet diner nearby. When he returned to the parking lot, he wasn't sure if she'd still be there. Part of him worried she might have been forced to move by security or simply driven away in fear. But there she was, the blue car, the sleeping mother and child. He approached gently again, not wanting to startle her. Alyssa stirred when he tapped softly on the window. She looked at him with a mix of surprise and disbelief. "You came back," she whispered, her voice rough from sleep. "I said I would," he replied with a soft smile, placing the food on the hood of her car before handing her the duffel. "I thought you might need a few more things." Tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. It wasn't just the things, it was the gesture. It was someone caring without strings attached. She opened the bag and gasped when she saw everything. "You didn't have to." "I know," Keanu said gently, "but I wanted to. And I was wondering if you'd be okay having breakfast with me. There's a bench right over there. It's a bit more comfortable than a car seat." Alyssa hesitated. Her instinct told her to guard her baby, to stay in the cocoon she'd built from fear and necessity. But something in Keanu's voice, in the kindness of his eyes, made her take a small leap. She nodded and carefully bundled Noah in the new blanket he'd given her. Together, they walked to the bench, sat down, and began to eat under the soft morning light. As they shared a quiet meal, the silence between them slowly softened. Keanu didn't ask invasive questions. He didn't try to fix anything. He just sat with her, offering his presence. Eventually, Alyssa spoke. "I wasn't always like this," she began, her voice fragile. "I used to have a job, a small apartment. I worked at a bookstore. I loved it. I used to read to kids during story hour every Saturday. It made me feel like I was doing something that mattered. Then, I got pregnant. My boyfriend said he was excited, but he changed. Quickly. The night I told him I wanted to keep the baby, he left. And everything else fell apart after that." Keanu listened quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. He didn't interrupt. He let her speak. "I tried to keep my job, but the hours got harder the further along I got. No family nearby. Rent went up. I couldn't afford childcare when Noah came. So I lost everything. Little by little. I applied for shelters, tried getting into programs, but the wait lists are endless. And sometimes, people just treat you like you're not even human anymore, like you don't deserve to be seen." Keanu leaned back, exhaling slowly. You do deserve to be seen. I see you, Alyssa. I see everything you've done just to survive. That takes strength most people can't even imagine. She looked at him, her lip trembling. Why do you care? You're famous. You could be anywhere, doing anything. Because I've been in dark places too, he replied gently. And I know what it means when someone reaches a hand down to lift you instead of walking past. For the first time, Alyssa smiled. A real, honest smile. It wasn't just gratitude, it was connection. A spark of something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. They sat there a while longer, watching as the city slowly came alive. People passed by them. Some glanced over, recognizing Keanu with wide eyes, but none dared interrupt. There was something sacred about that moment, something fragile and real. When the time came to leave, Keanu reached into his pocket and handed Alyssa a small card. I have a friend, he said. She runs a safe space for women and children. It's not a shelter. It's a stepping stone, a place where you can breathe, reset, and start again. I called her this morning. She said she'd be honored to meet you. Alyssa stared at the card as if it were made of gold. You did all that. Keanu nodded. Only if you want to go. No pressure. I just didn't want to leave you here without a next step. Her eyes filled again. I want to go. Keanu stood, helped her gather Noah and her few belongings, and walked with her to her car. He even offered to follow her, just to make sure she didn't get lost. And as they drove through the morning traffic, something beautiful unfolded, not because a celebrity showed up, but because one human decided to care. Truly care. Alyssa didn't know what the future held. She still had a long road ahead. But in that moment, she knew something had changed. Not just her situation, but her heart. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't forgotten. She was seen. She was supported. And sometimes that's all it takes to begin healing. Behind her, Keanu drove quietly, his fingers resting on the steering wheel as he glanced at the car in front of him. It was still the same old blue sedan. Still dented. Still worn. But to him, it now looked like something powerful. A vessel of resilience. A symbol of a mother who refused to give up. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something too. Pride. Not in himself, but in what people can do for one another. He had no idea that this small act of kindness would inspire a ripple effect. That the next few days would ignite a media storm, not for fame or glory, but for the right reasons. A reminder to the world that even in the darkest times, we are never truly alone. If someone is brave enough to reach out and say, I see you. And that, as Keanu would soon find out, was only the beginning. A house with no locks, a heart with no walls. The drive to the shelter was quiet, but not heavy. In Alyssa's car, little Noah slept peacefully in his carrier seat, while his mother stared straight ahead, her hands firmly gripping the wheel, knuckles white with silent anxiety. She didn't speak much, but Keanu could sense the swirl of thoughts racing behind her tired eyes. There was uncertainty, of course. Change always came with a little fear. But beneath it, there was something more subtle, more fragile. Hope that hadn't dared breathe in years. Behind her, Keanu followed at a patient distance in his own car, occasionally catching glimpses of her through the foggy rear window. He wasn't rushing her. He was just there. They arrived at a quiet side street tucked away between an elementary school and a public library. Places that hummed with daily life, with routine and laughter. The building itself didn't look like much from the outside. A modest two-story house painted in gentle cream and forest green, with a front porch and a faded wooden swing hanging from an old oak tree. But there was something warm about it, like the house itself had a soul. On the porch stood a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked curls and a wide, grounding smile. Her name was Linda, and her eyes told Alyssa everything she needed to know. This was a place where no one would ask, "How did you end up like this?" but instead say, "We're so glad you're here." Alyssa stepped out of her car slowly, nervously brushing down her sweater, as if trying to make a better first impression. Keanu joined her, staying back just enough to let Alyssa lead but close enough that she never felt alone. Linda approached without hesitation and reached out, not for a handshake, but for Noah. Her arms opened like a grandmother's would, her expression softening as the baby stirred in his sleep. "May I?" she asked gently. Alyssa froze, but only for a second. Then she nodded. Watching Linda cradle her child with such ease and affection made something catch in her throat. She didn't remember the last time someone had held her baby without judgment or obligation. Just love. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt more like a cozy home than a facility. The walls were decorated with watercolor paintings made by children. There was a faint scent of lavender and warm cinnamon, and gentle music played from an old stereo in the hallway. A fireplace flickered in the living room, and in the kitchen, a pot of soup simmered quietly. It didn't feel like a place for the broken. It felt like a place to become whole. Linda guided Alyssa upstairs to a room painted a soft sky blue, with a crib already set up beside a clean twin bed, folded towels on the dresser, and a small card placed on the pillow that simply read, "Welcome home." That's when the tears came. Not the kind Alyssa had cried in desperation. These were different. These were the tears that fall when your body finally stops bracing for disaster, when your soul starts to believe that maybe, just maybe, it's safe now. Keanu didn't follow her up the stairs. He stayed in the kitchen with Linda for a moment, hands in his pockets, quiet but thoughtful. "She's strong," he said softly. Linda nodded. "More than she knows. But strength doesn't mean she has to carry it all alone. We'll help her remember that." Keanu smiled with a mix of relief and humility. "That's all I ever hoped for." Later that afternoon, before Keanu left, Alyssa came back downstairs. Her face was different, not fully at ease yet, but no longer carrying the armor of survival. She walked to where Keanu stood by the door, Noah now resting peacefully in her arms. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "You don't owe me anything," Keanu replied gently. "You've already done the hardest part. You kept going. That's more than most can say." She bit her lip, her eyes growing wet again. "It's been so long since someone helped me without asking what I did wrong." He reached out and touched Noah's tiny hand with the tip of his finger. "You didn't do anything wrong. Life just gets hard sometimes. That doesn't mean you're undeserving of help." As he turned to go, Alyssa called out one more time, "Keanu." He looked back. "I'll make it, I promise." He smiled. "I know you will." Over the next few days, Alyssa settled in at the safe house. There were routines to follow, soft rules to help her regain structure. She attended wellness sessions, parenting classes, and was gently introduced to a job readiness coach. More importantly, she made friends. Other women who had stories just as complicated, just as painful, just as brave. They didn't trade trauma. They exchanged encouragement, laughter, and late-night whispers about dreams they thought they'd forgotten. Linda became like a mother figure, often offering hugs without asking and advice without preaching. Little Noah became the house's honorary prince, cooed by every resident, held with joy, never judged for his mother's circumstance. For the first time, Alyssa began to feel human again, not just surviving, but slowly beginning to live. Meanwhile, Keanu kept his distance, not out of indifference, but out of respect. He didn't want to be her rescuer. He just wanted to be the man who helped her take the first step. But he checked in quietly, through Linda, through a local community outreach friend who updated him once a week. Each message brought a quiet satisfaction to his heart. Then, the story broke. It started when a volunteer at the safe house posted a heartfelt message on social media, something simple and anonymous. "Today we welcomed a young mother and her baby into our home. They were sleeping in their car when a man many of you know helped them find their way to us. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he cares. And this, my friends, is how we change the world. No names were mentioned, no details, but people began to connect the dots. Photos surfaced. Keanu spotted near the house, near the parking lot days earlier. Whispers turned into headlines. Blogs wrote stories. News outlets picked it up. Keanu Reeves quietly helps homeless mother and baby into safe house. Kindness over fame. Keanu's latest role off-screen will melt your heart. A simple act, a massive ripple. Keanu's humanity on display. People were stunned. Not because Keanu had done something extraordinary, but because he had done it quietly, expecting nothing in return. In a world saturated with curated charity and public gestures, his humility was revolutionary. When Alyssa saw the headlines, she froze. Her heart raced with a strange mix of emotions: fear, gratitude, protectiveness. She didn't want pity. She didn't want to be turned into a symbol. But when she read the comments, something shifted. Thousands of people had written, "I was in a similar place. This story gave me hope. Thank you, Keanu, for reminding us what kindness looks like. She's so strong. I hope she knows that. People like her deserve the world." And for the first time, Alyssa didn't feel ashamed of her past. She felt proud of her present. She had become a symbol, not of failure, but of resilience. And she had a voice now, one that people were listening to. Later that evening, she sat at the window of her room, Noah asleep in her lap, and she began to write. Not a post, not a tweet, a letter, a real one. In it, she poured her heart out. She wrote about how one stranger changed everything, not by saving her, but by seeing her, by walking alongside her instead of ahead. She didn't know what would happen next, but she ended it with these words: "I may not have a house of my own yet, but thanks to you, I have a home inside me, and it's filled with light." The echo of kindness reaches farther than we know. The morning sun filtered through the soft white curtains of the safe house, touching Alyssa's cheek with a gentle warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the sunlight. It was the warmth of belonging, the steady breath of a life slowly rebuilding itself. As Noah slept peacefully in his crib, Alyssa stood near the mirror and caught sight of herself. For the first time in months, maybe years, she looked at her reflection and didn't just see struggle. She saw a mother, a fighter, a woman slowly reclaiming her dignity and dreams. The lines under her eyes hadn't vanished, and the past hadn't magically disappeared, but something in her posture had changed. She stood taller. She believed, just a little more. Her letter to Keanu had been dropped off at Linda's request the previous evening, and though she didn't expect a reply, writing it had been healing. There was something sacred in thanking someone, not just for what they gave, but for how they made you feel human again. She didn't know if he'd read it. She didn't need him to. But a part of her hoped he would feel what she had felt that morning in the parking lot: seen, valued, and quietly loved. Meanwhile, across town, Keanu sat on his sunlit balcony, sipping black coffee with a quiet gaze. The letter lay open in his lap, its creases soft from being read several times already. Her words were raw, honest, and untouched by pride. They carried a kind of wisdom only pain could teach and a kind of hope only motherhood could plant. He read her final sentence again, underlining it with his eyes. "I may not have a house of my own yet, but thanks to you, I have a home inside me." He closed his eyes, allowing the words to settle deep in his heart. Keanu wasn't known for crying, not in public anyway. But a single tear slid down his cheek, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming truth that a simple choice had touched someone's soul forever. He didn't want credit. He didn't want media stories or praise. But he understood now. Acts of kindness don't end with the act itself. They ripple, they echo, and sometimes they come back wrapped in someone else's healing words. He reached for his journal, the one he rarely let anyone see, and began to write. He didn't write about fame or movies or awards. He wrote about that parking lot, about a baby wrapped in a thin blanket, about a mother who clung to hope like it was her last possession, and about how they reminded him of something so deeply human: the power of presence, of just being there. No script, no cameras, just one heart meeting another. As news of Alyssa's story continued to spread online, something unexpected began to happen. Messages began pouring into the safe house from all over the world. Letters, donations, offers of mentorship. One woman from Canada offered to send books for Noah when he got older. A retired teacher from Georgia asked if she could volunteer remotely, helping other young moms like Alyssa with education goals. Even a cafe in New Zealand sent a shipment of baby food and diapers with a note that simply read, "We saw your light from across the ocean." Alyssa was stunned. She had never thought of herself as someone who could inspire others. But now, every day, she received notes that reminded her just how much she mattered. They didn't all mention Keanu. Most were about her bravery, her perseverance, her choice to keep going when everything said give up. Linda pulled her aside one afternoon and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've become a lighthouse, Alyssa. You were just trying to survive, but now you're helping others find their way." Tears welled in Alyssa's eyes. She still struggled with guilt sometimes, with wondering if she deserved all this love after so many mistakes. But Linda reminded her that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means forgiving yourself enough to build a future. Soon, an opportunity came, a job training program through a partnership with a community center. It offered childcare, transportation support, and part-time hours that could grow into full-time employment. When Alyssa saw the flyer, she hesitated, unsure if she was ready. But Linda smiled and handed it to her with quiet confidence. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to show up. We'll help you through the rest." And she did. Alyssa walked into that community center with trembling hands and a fierce determination in her chest. She filled out the application with Noah tucked in a sling against her chest, his soft breaths anchoring her in the moment. She sat through the interview, nervous but honest, and when they offered her a spot, she cried right there at the table. It wasn't just a job. It was the beginning of freedom, a pathway out of survival and into stability. Keanu found out days later through a text from Linda. She got the training opportunity. She starts Monday. She's glowing, Keanu. He didn't respond with words. He simply sent a red heart emoji and stared at the message, smiling like a proud friend watching someone take flight. Later that week, Alyssa stood in front of the mirror again, this time in a simple blouse and slacks, donated from a nearby boutique that had read her story and insisted on helping. She touched her reflection and whispered softly, "You're doing it. You're actually doing it." Noah giggled behind her from his blanket on the floor, kicking his little legs in joy, as if sensing the shift in energy. She scooped him up, kissed his forehead, and whispered back, "We're doing it together." But the greatest surprise came just before she walked out that morning. Linda handed her a small box with a note. "From a friend who believes in beginnings." Inside the box was a pair of delicate earrings, nothing flashy, just simple silver drops that shimmered softly in the light. The card beneath them read, "For the woman who thought she had nothing left, but turned her pain into power. Keep going. The world is watching you shine." Alyssa pressed the earrings to her heart, not because of their material value, but because of what they symbolized. She had been seen again, not as a headline, not as a cause, but as a woman, a mother, a person rising. That day, as she walked out into the city's pulse, her steps were lighter, her back was straighter, and though fear still lived somewhere deep inside her, it was no longer in control. Hope had taken the wheel. And in another part of the city, Keanu sat by a window reading the morning paper, his coffee steaming in his hand. He saw a small editorial column tucked into the second section. The mother, the actor, and the world that watched. It was written by a journalist who had followed the story quietly, respectfully. It didn't focus on him. It focused on her, on how one woman's resilience sparked a global reminder that compassion still exists, that empathy is louder than noise, and that we all carry the power to change someone's life with something as small as a moment of kindness. Keanu folded the paper slowly and looked out the window at the rising sun. He didn't need applause. He didn't want attention. All he wanted was for the world to remember what Alyssa was now living proof of. Sometimes, all it takes is one person noticing, and everything changes. When roots begin to grow again, there is a quiet kind of transformation that doesn't announce itself with fanfare or applause. It doesn't shout or beg for attention. It unfolds softly, like petals pushing through cold soil toward the sun. That's what Alyssa's life felt like now. It wasn't perfect. There were still shadows. There were still moments when fear knocked on her door. But day by day, she kept rising. And slowly, she realized the woman who once slept in her car, holding her baby in the dark, was no longer the same woman she saw in the mirror each morning. It had been 6 weeks since she moved into the safe house. In that short time, she had completed her first round of training at the community center, earning top marks for her professionalism, her warmth, and her empathy. The instructors were impressed by how naturally she handled every task, even when overwhelmed. What they didn't know was that the pressure they saw on the surface was nothing compared to what she'd already survived. For Alyssa, this was the easy part now. Showing up, learning, trotting. She was already a master of doing hard things. Noah had grown more playful, more curious. He'd begun reaching for books, babbling in cheerful tones, and giggling at the sight of bubbles and ceiling fans. Watching him laugh was Alyssa's therapy. Every smile he gave her was proof that she hadn't failed, that despite all the broken pieces, she'd given him a chance to live without bitterness. He didn't know their past. He only knew her warmth, her voice, her arms, and that was enough. One afternoon, while Alyssa was helping organize a donation drive at the center, she heard someone call her name from behind. She turned, expecting to see a volunteer. But instead, she was met by a young woman she didn't recognize, a shy smile on her lips, holding a stroller with a sleeping toddler inside. "I'm sorry," the girl said, almost apologetically. "Are you Alyssa? The Alyssa from the article?" Alyssa paused, a little stunned. Yes, that's me." The girl's eyes filled instantly. "I just wanted to thank you. I was going to give up. I was staying in a friend's garage with my daughter. No heat, no food some nights. And then I read about you, about how you kept going, and how someone helped you. And it made me think maybe I wasn't alone." Alyssa's breath caught. She reached out instinctively, placing a hand over the young mother's. "You're not alone," she whispered. "You're never alone." They hugged right there in the hallway, two women bound not by shared pain, but by shared perseverance. That moment would stay with Alyssa forever, because it proved something she hadn't even realized yet. Her story wasn't just survival anymore. It was purpose. Meanwhile, Keanu continued to follow her progress quietly. He never showed up uninvited, never stepped into her story for credit. But he stayed connected, always aware, always proud. Once a week, Linda would send him a small update, always starting with the same phrase, "Your girl's still flying." And every time he read it, a smile spread across his face. In a world full of chaos and noise, this quiet little miracle unfolding miles away reminded him of what truly mattered. But even the brightest days come with their shadows. It was a cold Thursday morning when Alyssa received the call. The city was scaling back funding to several community programs, including the training initiative she was part of. Her supervisor, kind but flustered, explained that they could only keep on one trainee for the permanent role they'd promised, and while Alyssa had performed excellently, another applicant had seniority. She would no longer be moving into paid employment at the center. Just like that, her next step vanished. She stood there in silence after the call ended, Noah playing on a map beside her, completely unaware of the sudden shift in the air. Alyssa felt the familiar sting behind her eyes. The whisper of fear crept in again. What if you can't keep going? What if this was just a moment, not a turning point? She clenched her fists, the old panic threatening to rise. But this time, she didn't crumble. She didn't let it take her. Instead, she picked Noah up, kissed his forehead, and held him tighter than ever. Then she did something she had never done in her old life. She asked for help. She went to Linda, heart open, shame left behind. "I need to figure out what's next," she said. "I don't want to fall back. Not again." Linda didn't give her advice. She gave her space and a list of organizations that were looking for people like her. She also gave her the name of a local business owner, someone who ran a cafe that hired women from the safe house in flexible, supportive roles. The owner was a woman named Marcy, once a single mom herself. Alyssa called that day, and the next week, she started her new job, serving coffee with a side of hope. The hours were early, the work demanding, but the environment was full of life. Marcy, tough but loving, became another anchor in her life. "You've got hustle," she told Alyssa one morning as she balanced 3 trays. "But more than that, you've got heart, and that'll keep you standing even when the world doesn't." Days turned into weeks. Alyssa saved every dollar she could. Linda helped her create a basic budget, and other women at the safe house taught her tricks. How to shop smart, how to stretch a meal, how to build credit. It was like building a bridge while already walking across it. But Alyssa kept going. Her dream wasn't luxury. It was stability. A small apartment, a daycare near her job, a safe place for Noah to play, and a door she could lock at night, knowing it was hers. One quiet evening, Keanu showed up at the cafe. He wore a hoodie, sunglasses, and the kind of relaxed presence that didn't draw attention unless someone looked too closely. He ordered tea and sat by the window. When Alyssa walked out from the back and saw him, her mouth opened in stunned silence. He stood, smiled, and said simply, "I heard you make a mean cup of coffee." She laughed, really laughed. The kind of laugh that bubbles up from deep within and catches even the laugher by surprise. She poured his tea, sat across from him during her break, and they talked, not about the past, but about the future, about her goals, her new job, her dream of becoming a counselor for women like herself. "You'd be amazing at that," Keanu said, meaning it with every cell of his being. "You already are. You're the kind of voice people need." They didn't speak of fame or headlines. They didn't bring up how their first meeting had gone viral. None of that mattered. What mattered was the space between them, the space that had once been filled with desperation, now filled with strength. As the sun began to set, Keanu pulled something from his pocket, a small worn key on a simple ring. "I have an apartment," he said softly. "Nothing big. I bought it years ago for visiting friends. It's fully furnished, close to your job. A friend of mine handles the rentals. But I'd like you to have it. No rent for the first 6 months. After that, it's up to you. If you want it." Alyssa stared at him, frozen. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," he said gently. "Just keep building. That's all I want." Her fingers closed around the key. She didn't cry this time. She didn't tremble. She just looked at him with eyes full of something far deeper than gratitude. "I will." And she meant it. Home is where the healing begins. The first night in her new apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of stillness that pressed against Alyssa's chest, not with fear, but disbelief. It was strange, after months of restless nights in parking lots and shelters, to finally have silence as a companion. No honking, no distant arguments, no baby crying out of discomfort. Just peace. She stood by the window of the small but beautiful studio, staring out over the city, her arms wrapped around Noah, who was already fast asleep in a crib she'd assembled with help from the cafe staff earlier that afternoon. A mobile spun gently above him, casting tiny stars on the ceiling. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but this time, they didn't fall from pain. They came from the overwhelming realization that she'd made it, not to the end, but to a beginning, a safe beginning. The apartment was modest, a soft beige couch, a tiny kitchenette, a corner with second-hand bookshelves already filled by strangers who became family. On the table was a single card, handwritten and left earlier that day. "Welcome home. You earned this." Alyssa pressed her hand to the card, then held it against her heart. She whispered into the silence, "I'm going to honor this. Every single day." Life didn't magically become easy after that. It never does. But what changed was Alyssa's footing. She no longer woke up dreading the unknown. She woke up building something, even if it was one brick at a time. Her job at the cafe blossomed into a full-time role within 2 months. Marcy, the owner, offered to sponsor her for a community college program focused on social work after seeing how customers, especially young mothers, gravitated toward her. Alyssa began classes in the evenings, balancing work, motherhood, and education like a woman on fire, not out of panic, but purpose. Noah, now crawling and giggling nonstop, became the darling of the neighborhood. The tenants in her building knew him by name. An elderly woman down the hall knitted him a red beanie. The security guard in the lobby kept lollipops on hand just for him. It was as if the world was making up for every night he'd spent sleeping in that cold car. Keanu, true to his quiet nature, never stepped back into the spotlight of Alyssa's story. But he was always near, always watching from a distance like a quiet guardian angel. He checked in once a month, never expecting a reply but always offering encouragement. He sent a stack of books for her classes, a tiny bike for Noah's first birthday, a scholarship application form with a sticky note, "I think you're already qualified." And Alyssa responded, not with dependency, but with drive. Each gesture fueled her, not because of who it came from, but because it reminded her of who she was becoming. Keanu's kindness had not created her success. It had simply cleared a path she was already brave enough to walk. One rainy Sunday morning, nearly a year to the day after they first met, Alyssa returned to that same parking lot. She parked her now reliable used car in the exact spot where her old sit-in once sat, and just sat. Noah, now a little bigger and much more curious, sat in the back seat kicking his feet. She looked out at the quiet street, the same sidewalk, the same tree, and she felt the weight of the journey she had taken. It was surreal. She pulled out her phone and snapped a photo, not for social media, but for herself. A reminder that this place of pain had become the root of her growth. She decided to write one last letter. She didn't know if she'd send it, but she needed to write it. Sitting in that very spot, her words flowed like water from a well finally full again. "Dear Keanu, 1 year ago, you stopped in this very lot and saw something I didn't even see in myself. Worth, strength, hope. I was just surviving. I was scared and cold, and barely breathing beneath the weight of the world. But you didn't walk past. You didn't give advice. You gave your presence, and that changed everything. Not because you saved me, but because you reminded me I could save myself. Today, I am working full-time. I'm a student. I have my own apartment. And most importantly, I'm a mother who can look her son in the eye and say, 'We're safe.' That means more than any words I'll ever write. But there's something else I want you to know. Your kindness didn't end with me. I shared my story with young mothers at shelters. I've sat across from girls who've hit rock bottom and told them, 'It gets better. I promise.' I've seen their eyes light up, not because I had the answers, but because I had proof that rising is possible. You showed me what real generosity is, not charity, but belief. You believed in me when I didn't, and now I believe in others. So thank you, not for the apartment or the gifts or the support. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing to care. And thank you for reminding the world that kindness still matters. With all my heart, Alyssa," and Noah, who now runs faster than I can catch him. She folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. She wouldn't mail it just yet. Maybe someday, but for now, she pressed it into her journal. The same one she had begun during her first week in the safe house. The same one that carried tears, poems, and victories. That journal had become her timeline of transformation. As she looked out the window again, rain pattering gently on the glass, she whispered to herself, "This is what healing looks like." And in a quiet corner of Los Angeles, Keanu Reeves sat by a window, watching the same rain fall from a sky that had once carried clouds of despair. He didn't know about the letter yet, but he felt something in his chest, like the world had shifted gently toward good again. He smiled, reached for his own notebook, and wrote a single line across the page. We don't always need to change the world. Sometimes we just need to help someone find their way back to it. And that was everything.